Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, June 12th, 2020. My name is Pam. Let's begin with our first article. He woke up the world. Houston's Third Ward remembers George Floyd, by Henry Gass and Camilla Smith. Have we been here before? The civil unrest seen across the United States since a Minneapolis police officer killed George Floyd may be rivaled only by the chaotic summer of the late 1960s, when racial tensions, the civil rights movements, and the Vietnam War fueled widespread protests and rioting. Houston and the Third Ward, the historically black neighborhood where Mr. Floyd grew up, experienced that late 60s unrest, including a violent encounter in 1967 on the campus of Texas Southern University, or TSU, a historically black college in the Third Ward that saw police arrest almost 500 students and shoot up a dormitory. Race riots broke out in cities around the country in those months, a period now known as the long, hot summer of 1967. In a report analyzing the cause of the unrest, the Kerner Commission concluded that white Americans were largely to blame for maintaining systemic inequality between black and white Americans. President Lyndon Johnson didn't act on those conclusions, and a year later, protests again erupted across the country, again including Houston, after the assassination of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Because before it was only one community, authorities could ignore it, says Ronald Goodwin, a history professor at Prairie View A&M University, of earlier protests by the black community. Now you can't ignore it. Houston, which hosted a memorial service for Mr. Floyd Monday, has seen daily protests demanding justice for his death. Yet the civil unrest of this moment is different. Locals and experts say, in ways that represent not just social progress, but a broader disillusionment with American institutions that could be an even tougher problem to tackle than what the country faced 50 years ago. While we should be focused on police brutality in black communities, what this has brought out is a broad discontent in society. And that's something we need to be concerned about and take seriously, says Marcus Casey, an economist at the University of Illinois Chicago and the Brookings Institution. Adding to the urgency of today's response, over the past 5 years, police have killed about 1,000 Americans every year. That number has not changed despite promises of reform after the massive riots and protests resulting from high-profile deaths of African Americans, including Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, and Freddie Gray. In the Third Ward, Brother Deloyd T. Parker Jr., who runs a local community center and knew Mr. Floyd, has been protesting police brutality for decades, but this time, he acknowledges, is different. I'm very hurt about what happened to George, he said, but I'm hurt every time. There's a George every day. What happened to George was the straw that broke the camel's back. What that uncovered and unveiled is a lot of injustices that have taken place all over the country and all over the world, he adds. He's pretty much a symbol now. Everybody is here. When 60,000 people demonstrated here last week, one thing stood out to many Houstonians in the crowd: the diversity of the people around them. You see Asians, you see whites, you see Latinos, you see Indians, Native Americans. Everybody is here, said Ephesian Fields, a black woman during the protest. Things may change, she added, but at the end of the day, all we need is hope. All we have is hope, and the protests show hope. The need for the protests was bluntly apparent to many protesters. Anybody with a skin color that ain't white, we get treated, and then there was an expletive, says Eduardo Reyes, sporting a Mexican flag bandana around his neck. His girlfriend, Kazir Barrett, was wearing an SUC pullover, the name of the rap group Mr. Floyd belonged to. Though through tears, she said the objective was to march in peace. It could be my dad, it could be my brother, it could be a loved one, or it could be me, she added. At the end of the day, none of us are safe. We just want to be safe. That diversity is perhaps not surprising for Houston, a majority-minority city, but the nationwide protests over Mr. Floyd's killing have been diverse in another way: geography. In Texas, major cities have seen protests, but so have small towns with small black populations. Demonstrators have gathered in downtown New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, but also in those cities' suburbs. Protesters have turned out in majority white cities like Salt Lake City, Utah, and Des Moines, Iowa. The cell phone video that captured Mr. Floyd's last moments, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on his neck for nearly 9 minutes while he begged for breath, is visceral and horrifying, even compared to other videos of police killings. Mr. Chauvin has been charged with second-degree murder. The 3 other officers who participated in detaining Mr. Floyd face charges of aiding and abetting his killing. And to be sure, racism, police brutality, and the Black Lives Matter movement are the banner issues for the protesters. But in this moment of heightened disillusionment, there are a host of other issues driving people onto the streets. The financial and psychological shock of the COVID-19 pandemic is certainly a factor. Whether it be for Zenzers entering the job market or millennials still recovering from the Great Recession, the pandemic has hit Houston's large oil and gas industry especially hard. But more than half the country also disapproves of President Donald Trump's performance. Half of Americans believe that Supreme Court justices don't set aside personal or political views when they are making rulings, and have very little confidence in Congress. Even more Americans are increasingly concerned that issues like the threat of white nationalism and climate change aren't getting enough attention. There's a growing pessimism about the institutions in the United States, the elite, says Professor Casey. That's what's driving broader participation. People of all races feel this growing inequality in society, the idea that institutions aren't very responsive to the rank and file, he adds. They see those things as linked to police brutality. The Tray. For decades, police brutality has rarely not been top of mind in the Third Ward. In 1967, protests broke out in Houston after a child drowned in the Holmes Road dump, a landfill in a black community. As protests continued and tensions climbed, Houston police raided the TSU campus on the early morning of May 17th, firing around 3,000 rounds into Lanier Dormitory and arresting 488 students. Only 5 students were eventually charged, and they were all exonerated. While much of the late 60s unrest was racially diverse, the civil rights movement in particular, the riots of the long hot summer, were characterized by events like that at TSU, unrest sparked by local grievances in black communities over issues like police brutality and poor living conditions. This moment is different, and in many ways the Third Ward is different too. When Mr. Floyd was growing up there, Mr. Parker says the neighborhood, known as the Tray, had just begun to change. It was blacker, he adds. You wouldn't see many people of European extraction walking their dogs down the street. Mr. Floyd spent time at Shape Community Center, which Mr. Parker co-founded in 1969. He attended Jack Yates High School, named after one of the area's earliest Baptist pastors, and having shot up to 6 feet 6 inches tall, stood out in football and basketball, helping the school get to the state championship in 1992. After dropping out of college, he returned to the Third Ward and helped establish the city's renowned hip-hop scene. After getting into trouble with the law and spending 4 years in prison, he returned to the Third Ward with a new dedication to improving his community. He would often stop by the Shape Center and talk to kids. He'd always come with a positive attitude, a positive disposition, Mr. Parker recalls. He wasn't content with who he was. He wanted to be better. He was on the move to doing that, he adds, but he was robbed of doing that. Diversity and solidarity. Last week, as the march was finishing a few miles away, the finishing touches were being put on a mural tucked onto a side street in one of the Third Ward's most neglected housing projects. It's become a landmark for those who want to pay their respects to Mr. Floyd and a beacon for people who live there. He woke up the world, said Leonard McGowan, a resident of the Cooney Homes project and a close friend of Mr. Floyd's. Mr. Floyd left Houston for Minneapolis around 2014, seeking a fresh start. The Third Ward, meanwhile, had been rapidly gentrifying. With black residents moving to suburbs and whites and Latinos moving in, the neighborhood's black population dropped from 79% in 2000 to 67% in 2015. The worry is that it could follow the same path as the Fourth Ward, a historic neighborhood created by freed slaves. Fourth Ward is oldest black community in Houston. It's not there no more. It's nothing but townhomes, says John Bunchy Creer, a former Black Panther Party member who has lived in the Third Ward for decades. For some black Houstonians marching in protests, they feel just as threatened by gentrification as they do the police and by the pandemic, which has disproportionately harmed African Americans. One thing that hasn't changed since the 60s, the wealth gap between black families and white families. The average white household in 2016 had the same median wealth as 11.5 black households combined. They're pushing us blacks out so they can gentrify Third Ward and pretty much erase our history, Ms. Fields said during last week's protest. That's just one more way of them trying to enslave us and not let us have anything. Not everyone in the Third Ward believes this change is wholly negative. Many admit that it is, to a degree, inevitable. The neighborhood used to be mostly Jewish until after World War II, and community groups have been working to prevent unchecked gentrification in favor of something more equitable. We can't stop people moving in. That's a lost battle, but we want to make sure we're as much in control of this community as we need to be, says Mr. Parker. Change is imminent, we know that, but let that change be positive change. More integration in American society seems to have bred solidarity in the George Floyd protests, says Professor Casey. With more diversity in schools and neighborhoods, and with social media, the African American worldwide is more broadly understood than in the 1960s. There's more overlapping spheres, so something that affected a black man in Minnesota might matter to a white person in Arizona, she says. Along with seeing the institutional issues, it feels much more personal across the country. Looking at protests over Mr. Floyd's death around the world, Mr. Parker thinks it's even bigger than that. This is a global movement, he said. And how would Mr. Floyd feel if he could see this now? He'd be excited that black people and people of conscience and people who love freedom are standing up, says Mr. Parker. I can see him smiling right now. Moving on, this next article, titled Coronavirus Shortages Give Russia's Charity Sector a New Spark, by Fred Weir in Moscow. Nearly 80 years ago, Zenaida Korneva marched 1,400 miles from Stalingrad to Berlin as an anti-aircraft gunner in the Soviet Army, fighting all the way. Today, almost a centenarian, she is one of the few remaining combat veterans of World War II and feels called to arms again. Miss Korneva's daughter and granddaughter, both doctors in St. Petersburg, informed her about the immense challenges they were facing in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. That included exhausting hours, shortages of critical equipment and protective gear, and the constant danger of getting infected themselves. So with help from the youthful portion of her extended family, Miss Korneva set up a YouTube channel and began offering her reminiscences of the war in order to raise money to help the families of about 10 local medical workers, whom she described as being on the front lines this time. She says a British friend, World War II veteran Captain Tom Moore, inspired her by raising almost $40 million for Britain's National Health Service by walking laps in his backyard. Her YouTube channel has since garnered about 14,000 subscribers, while over 4 million rubles, or about $60,000, has poured into her donation page. That's enough to help more than 100 families by her estimate. We are all in this together, just as we were during the war, she said. Back then we could see our enemy and we knew how to deal with him. Now it's an invisible enemy and there is no vaccine. Scientists all over the world are racing to find it, while our doctors fight to preserve lives. What each of us must do is find ways to help them, to stop people from dying. Ms. Korneva is not alone among Russians in taking the coronavirus pandemic as a clarion call. Hundreds of private initiatives have sprung up in the past couple months, some of them quite innovative. They range from filling holes in the existing public health system to circumventing bureaucratic bottlenecks to just helping ease the plight of vulnerable people trapped in quarantine. Many existing charities quickly repurposed their activities to help beleaguered state medical services speed and improve their response to the crisis. This aspect of social life in Russia, the charitable sector, is relatively new and generally overlooked, says Masha Lippman, editor of Counterpoint, a journal of Russian affairs published by George Washington University. When this disaster struck, it caught Russia unprepared, as it did most countries, and it created many new challenges that private initiatives stepped in to meet, making a difference. One of those was the Zhovy Living Foundation, which normally helps hospitals and patients with severe medical problems with logistical and other forms of assistance. The group's director, Victoria Agzhanova, says that when the pandemic struck, many hospitals began to adjust to treat COVID-19, suspending their own regular operations. We realized that in order to resume our usual work, we needed first to help defeat this pandemic threat, she said. One of the biggest problems in the early stages, she said, was that doctors and hospitals were unable to directly order supplies of personal protective equipment and other critical gear. They were required to submit a request to the Department of Health, which would stage a tender and eventually purchase and deliver the supplies. It wasn't until April 17th that the State Duma adopted a law on simplifying the procurement process. The delays meant that lots of doctors and medical workers were in danger of getting infected, said Mrs. Agzhanova. Hospital managers were left to either pretend there was no problem or risk their jobs by publicly calling for help. Groups like the Zhovy Foundation and the private citizens rescue service Zoydany Creation, also means creation, slashed through the red tape by locating supplies of PPEs, sitting in warehouses or shops, buying it and delivering it straight to the hospitals that needed it. The authorities neither helped us nor hampered us, says Jelena Smirnova, head of the Zoydany. But we had dozens of requests from medical workers and we knew what we had to do. One organization that did briefly get into trouble with authorities in early April was the Doctors Alliance, a medical workers group associated with opposition leader Alexei Navalny. While delivering PPEs to a remote hospital in western Russia, the group's leader, Anastasia Vasileva, was detained by police and reportedly abused for allegedly disobeying a local ordinance. She was released the next day, but the case made global headlines and may have persuaded Russian authorities to change their approach. We were accused of spreading fake information, of using charity for political PR purposes, of staging provocations and whatnots, said Ivan Konovalov, press spokesman for the Doctors Alliance. But with the passing of time, the authorities have realized that this is not the best way to struggle against us. We haven't had these difficulties since then. The authorities themselves realize that problems do exist, especially after Putin recognized this fact in one of his addresses. Finding an understanding with government. The case underlined the tension that exists between the new charity sector, whose assistance is genuinely welcomed by the public, and authorities who can become irate at activities that highlight the deficiencies of state services. The government doesn't mind established charity groups stepping in, says Ms. Lippman. They do mind what they see as alarmist and critical comments that emphasize how bad things are. Ideally, I think the authorities would prefer that charities act, but do so quietly. Russia's government has actually promoted the creation of an official volunteer movement, My Vmeste, or meaning us together, which organizes companies and individuals to help out with things like coronavirus hotlines, free legal consultations, and facilities for remote work and distance learning. One of its most successful services has been to organize armies of mostly useful volunteers to assist elderly people in self-isolation by buying and delivering groceries and medicines and helping out with other necessary chores. Angelina Fitoz, a prominent Moscow lawyer, is offering her services pro bono to doctors who can't keep up with payments when they get sick or are having trouble receiving promised hazard bonuses and overtime pay. I just want to help doctors, one professional to another, and not make a big deal out of it, she says. Alyona Dolchevskaya, former editor of Vogue Russia and a prolific author and TV personality, is one of many Russian celebrities who've come up with their own ways to help. She has put aside and sold 500 signed and boxed copies of her latest book and raised about $35,000. I'm the daughter of two doctors. They raised me, and I learned to see the world through their eyes, she says. I know everyone is suffering in this crisis, but doctors have special concerns. Experts say there are innumerable individuals and group initiatives like this springing up around the country. The government is learning to welcome them, and it might well leave permanent changes in Russia's social landscaping after the crisis has passed. And maybe some of those changes will be universal. I hope the world will become a different place after this, says Ms. Korneva. I want countries to realize that working together to solve problems is the only way. I hope no one ever thinks about war again. This article is titled Deepwater Horizon: What We Learned from the Worst Oil Spill Ever by Doug Struck. Christopher Reddy had it. The scientist had been studying oil spills for 15 years, but he was frustrated that his lab's work was ignored by both government and industry. He figured it was time to do something else. A few weeks later, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded. I got a call from a government scientist I knew very well. He said, "We need someone to go down and do field work." And I told him, "Nah, I quit science. I'm done." The Deepwater Horizon explosion on April 20, 2010, soon became the world's biggest maritime oil leak, and Dr. Reddy, a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, soon found himself headed to Louisiana. The guy's boss, who I was really good friends with, called me several days later, and he said, "Listen, you got to get over this whole quitting this oil spill thing. Here's the deal. You are going to get involved. You will do some good science, and it will change your career, and you will make a huge impact," Dr. Reddy recalls with a chuckle. And he was absolutely right. The eruption at the wellhead a mile underneath the BP Deepwater Horizon drilling rig 10 years ago was a catastrophic disaster. It killed 11 oil workers, injured 17 more, and poisoned thousands of square miles of water, air, beach, and marsh. Millions of marine animals and seabirds died at the Gulf's vital seafood and tourist industries were paralyzed, bankrupting workers and businesses. The well jetted more than 200 million gallons of oil and gas into the water for 87 days until it was finally capped July 15, 2010. The harm from the accident, which dwarfed the 1989 Exxon Valdez spill of 11 million gallons, was indisputable. But scientists, while paying homage to the tragedy, say the spill spawned a bonus: 10 years of intense research into the Gulf of Mexico and oil spills. It's been hugely successful, says Rita Colwell, an acclaimed microbiologist who headed the National Science Foundation and agreed to take a 10-year post to direct the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, or the GOMRI, funded with $500 million from BP. The initiative lists assistance from 4,400 researchers, involvement of more than 380 other scientific groups, production of more than 3,000 sets of data, and 1,400 published papers, not including research done outside of GOMRI. "We've just been hugely productive, and we've worked really hard to keep the public informed," Dr. Colwell said by telephone from her home near Washington. "The program is wrapping up, and it's work with a holistic overview of the research," she says. The conclusions of the science are not unequivocal. The role of dispersants, which were injected in the oil plume underwater for the first time, still remains contentious. But researchers did find that natural microbes ate a lot more of the oil than expected. They also found there's a narrow window before sunlight converts liquid oil on the surface to a sticky sludge that does not respond to dispersants. They found that many species recovered faster than predicted, while other species were devastated for some generations. And the researchers established a foundation of data about the ecology of the Gulf of Mexico that had not existed before. Science often focuses on the smallest molecule or the smallest microorganism, Dr. Colwell said. The deep water research, she adds, involved many in the Gulf community and points to the need to take a broader view that includes impacts on people. It's not enough to study the physics or the dispersion of oil or the chemistry without understanding the social impacts, which were really extensive in the Gulf, Dr. Colwell said. Many others agree. There was a lot of science done, says Dr. Reddy, who played a key role in the post-spill efforts at the Gulf. 10 years later, we spent millions and millions of dollars to study the spill. We know a lot about this spill. But, he adds, like many scientists, he's not completely satisfied. He says the initial field work should have included better planning to test and measure different approaches. We don't have a consensus agreement about using disbursements on the bottom of the seafloor, he notes. With another spill, we have unfinished business. There's going to be pushback because they didn't have that data. The BP spill also carried consequences for government, though there is much less consensus on the outcome. Every oil spill is an assault on the environment, but each provides lessons. After an oil well blowout near Santa Barbara, California in 1969, public outrage helped spawn the first Earth Day and a quick succession of far-reaching federal environmental laws. The Valdez oil spill in 1989 led to the banning of single-hull tankers and navigation safeguards that significantly reduced spills from cargo ships. A May 29th spill of 20,000 metric tons from a diesel storage tank in the Arctic Circle is still challenging efforts to contain it. The Deepwater Horizon spill, too, brought cries for industry and government action. A bipartisan commission appointed by President Barack Obama called for tougher safety practices, more and better blowout preventers, and independence of the federal agency overseeing drilling safety enforcements. Many of those governmental advances have been rolled back under the Trump administration, which has waged a relentless assault on environmental safety and health regulations that stretch back to Richard Nixon's presidency. Donald Bosch, a member of the Presidential Commission, said the government has lost credibility with its own inspectors and the public as President Donald Trump and his appointees emphasize a desire to produce more oil and get off the backs of industries, with safety a seeming afterthought. There was progress, he said. We are in a better position to be able to tap a well, cap a blowout, much more quickly than we were, Dr. Bosch says, and he acknowledges the voluminous scientific research that followed the deep water event. But then I would add to that, so what? Dr. Bosch says from his home in Annapolis, Maryland, we have learned a lot about what the oil does in the environment, but I don't think that science has really put us in a better position to respond to another oil spill like that. Industry would use much the same cleanup techniques for future spills, he said, and it would still be pretty ineffective. Nancy Kinner, co-director of the Coastal Response Research Center at the University of New Hampshire, argues that the research gives oil spill responders more tools of knowledge. Now we have a better picture of the whole system, and we understand that if you push here, you have a response there. I don't ever want to say that the Deepwater spill was a good thing. It was a horrible, horrible thing in so many ways, Dr. Kinner says from her home in Georgetown, Maine. What I prefer to say is adversity often gives us the best opportunity to become better. Too Many Figs, or So I Thought, by Mary Ekstrand. I ate them, I made jam, I gave them to friends, I sold them, I grew desperate. Enter the fish people. My fig tree had too many figs, like too many cooks in the kitchen, or like planting too many zucchini plants. They were complicating my life. I dried them, made jam with them, and eaten them until I thought my skin would turn brownish green. If I let them fall on the ground, they became a sticky mess underfoot that attracted irritable yellow jackets. I couldn't imagine picking them and throwing them away. I had a problem, not unlike my visiting granddaughter's problem one morning when she complained to me, "These pancakes have too many blueberries." Faithful fig-loving friends came to my rescue at first. Many others turned up their noses at these odd fruit, the flesh of which frankly looks like hundreds of little pink worms. But anyone who likes figs, I discovered, adores them. I could count on 4 friends to show up when I put out the call. They often had recipes to suggest or their favorite ways of eating them. But one summer, even they couldn't keep up. When I noticed the going price for figs at my supermarket, I put up a figs for sale sign at the end of the driveway and left a few containers of figs at my back door with a can for the money. That worked for a year or two. People were amazingly honest, and some even paid $1 or 2 extra or didn't take change. But supply and demand is tricky with figs. Figs are not a patient fruit. We had an especially warm summer that year, and even though my sign warned, "These figs won't last long, keep in your refrigerator," a woman came back a couple days later complaining that her figs had not lasted. I gave her another dozen, but she was not my favorite customer. My favorite customer was a pleasant man who arrived at my door and wanted way more figs than I had set out. He and I went out to the tree and picked a couple more containers full. He told me he and his wife had a home in my neighborhood in the Seattle area, but they also had a home in Alaska where they both had worked. She still worked for the airlines, so they traveled back and forth frequently. We don't have a lot of fresh fruit in Alaska, so I've been driving around looking for fruit to pick to take back up there. I was shocked he was taking figs to Alaska. "You know these don't have a shelf life," I said. "They won't last long." The problem, he said, he wanted to try. Oh, no problem, he said, he wanted to try. After that introduction, he became my best customer. I took down the figs for sale sign. By the second year, he and his wife were stopping by and picking figs themselves. That fall, they stopped to ask if I liked salmon. Did I like salmon? Wild Alaskan salmon is the best, and I could rarely afford to buy it. By the next summer, my freezer had a ready supply of salmon, halibut, and red snapper. My new friends, Doug and Trish, had free picking access, their favorites being the fig and pear trees. I couldn't choose a favorite fish. They were all delicious. Last summer, my extended family gathered at my house for a celebration of my mother's life. When the fish people, as my family called them, heard what they were doing, they insisted on bringing a big package of smoked salmon, frozen salmon, halibut, and shrimp. My fearless son and his wife took over the barbecue. We had more than enough to serve nearly 20 of us. My mom loved family, Alaska, and fish. How she would have enjoyed that day. The Bible mentions figs several times, beginning with modest Adam and Eve. Buddha received his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, or sacred fig. My fig tree brought me enlightenment too. I had seen the abundance of my fig tree as a problem to be solved, an inconvenience and a bother. But I discovered that abundance, when shared, brings connections and loving friendships. Doug and Trish drop by occasionally for a quick visit, and Doug has promised to bring me old photos of our neighborhood as he grew up here. My fig tree is a treasure that has fed me, my friends and family, and now my new friends. It also taught me that, like friends, you just can't have too many figs. Well, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor. This is Pam saying, stay in if you can, stay safe, be blessed, and make it a great day.